Awesome. Well, we will go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody, to our fourth module. We have an awesome panel put together again for you today, and this one's a little bit more interactive, so it gets you a chance to talk with the panelists and also meet some of your cohort mates. You've been introducing yourself in the Slack, and so some time to connect a little bit further. Our basic syllabus and schedule there for you. We're working our way down. So effective advocacy strategies for policymakers today. Some announcements quick before we begin. Your podcast summary, we did go through all of your podcast summary and provide some feedback on there. And so you should be able to see that on our homework Excel sheet. There's feedback there. The writing piece outline what is due. It was due on May 24th, and if we're going to start reviewing those. And so if you haven't gotten that done and you do want some feedback on it, please get it in by tomorrow at the latest, so that we can make sure to include that while we're starting to get you our feedback. Upcoming, we do have it. I'm going to send out an email with links and examples and all sorts of things after this meeting. So don't worry if this isn't fully clear to you yet. But upcoming, we do have our elevator pitch videos that are going to be due by the end of the week. And along with that, they're kind of together, right, is the one-pager talking points. And a lot of you have already pretty much completed that by doing your elevator pitch outline, your drafts. You're just essentially going to take that, turn it into a video, and turn it into a one-pager. So most of that work is probably already done for those of you who have been doing that draft outlining. And now we're just kind of going to formalize it into a video and into a one-pager. And so that'll be due by the end of the week. And we'll get you some feedback on that as well. But like I said, watch for my email. They'll have examples and the links to everything in there. And if you've missed anything, feel free to go back to our YouTube channel, and we'll have all the recordings there. I think that is it for my announcements. So I will turn it over. We have a moderator for our session, Dan. I'll turn it over to you and you can get us started.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me. I'm very excited to talk to all the students today. I hope it's a lively and engaging conversation. I think we're going to kick it off with a brief talk, or with a talk from Aaron Heath, who is the Director of Federal Relations at the American Association for the Arts and Sciences. It's been a very long day. Director of Federal Relations, also known as AAAS, runs the largest science policy fellowship. I'm sure many of you have thought about joining it or have heard about it. I've had the great pleasure of working with Erin for quite a while, and I'll turn it over to her. Go ahead, Erin.
Thank you so much, Dan. I'm so happy to be here with all of you. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. Okay. Cool. All right, well, I am going to talk about, I have a standard presentation where I talk about a little bit about why you should care about communicating your science to policymakers, talk a little bit about how you should communicate, but mostly I offer practical tips on how to engage in policy. If you have an hour or a day or a week or a whole year. So if you've gone to the AAAS case workshop for students, you've seen part of this already, but hopefully it'll be a nice refresher. So last time I gave this talk to this course, it was during the pandemic, and it was all about virtual advocacy. So because we have just 15 minutes together, I'm going to continue to focus primarily on how to engage in policy virtually from wherever you are. But I know that a lot of what I say can apply in person as well. This is a time when you have options, perhaps the most we've ever seen when it comes to engaging in policy. So it's an exciting time in that way. Okay, so before we get to my practical tips, I like to spend a few minutes on some things to think about when you are communicating with policymakers. You've been talking about this already. This illustrates how the cultures of communicating are different in the science world and the policy world. This is the famous, or infamous perhaps, inverted triangle slide. So In fact, these two cultures are sort of polar opposites. When you're a scientist, you gather a lot of data, you spend a lot of time digging in to a topic, and after you've put in the work, you are able to come out with your results and your conclusion. The policymakers, they don't really want to hear about any of that process, at least not right away. They want to hear the bottom line. They want to hear your results first. That's the very first thing they generally want to hear. And then after you've given the bottom line, you have to hook them with the so what, the who cares piece. So it's only after you've given the bottom line and then you've convinced them to care that you can then fill in the supporting details and have a conversation. And by the way, you could take the word policymakers and swap it out with the word public. It's really the same concept. So all the advice you normally will hear about communicating your science, for example, avoiding jargon, that of course still holds true when you're interacting with a policymaker. And you can find myriad tips about this online if you Google the AAAS Communicating Science Toolkit. There's a lot of good tips on that. So when we teach science communication workshops, one of the things we suggest is coming up with 3 key points. The key points, they can serve as a foundation for your message, for what you want to say. And when I first gave this talk, as I mentioned, it was during the pandemic when we all had pivoted to virtual advocacy. And I came up with something I call the 3 C's for communicating: the context, courtesy, coordination, and courtesy. And while this was initially a COVID concept, it still applies today. So I'm keeping it going with the 3 C's, starting with context. Part of context is understanding the big picture. When you're communicating with the policymaker, it's also really important and helpful to know what are the major issues of the day. When you're communicating your science, it's not just about your science as much as we might really love it to be sometimes. There are a lot of other things going on in a policymaker's world. For one thing, we have an election coming up. That's going to guide much of the activity you see in Congress over the next few months. And also critical right now as ever are things like the broader economy and jobs. So just remember that science is not the only sector, nor are science policy issues the only issues. Second is understanding what's going on in the district. Your argument will be far stronger and more resonant if you connect it to what's going on back home. This includes what's happening in your lab or university. What's the exciting work you're doing? What do you wish you could do more or less that policy could help solve? What are your challenges and opportunities? And my third point here is have a sense of what can be done. This is sometimes called the ask. Beyond providing information about your scientific research, which is valuable in itself, is there something you can ask a policymaker to do about it? So maybe that's sponsoring or co-sponsoring a bill, or voting for a bill, or holding a hearing, or asking a question in a hearing, or speaking publicly, or writing about it. So that's context. Next is coordination. What are other organizations doing about this issue that you care about? Your message is going to be stronger as part of a larger unified effort. So how should you coordinate? Well, one thought is to reach out to your government relations office at your university. They're a great resource for issues as well as opportunities to engage in policy. Another thing I always recommend, and this is a close one to my heart because I work for a scientific society, is to check in with your scientific societies. I'm sure many of you belong to at least one, maybe multiple. And most major scientific societies have science policy offices or activities, and many offer ways that you can engage in policy. Are there established advocacy events out there that you can join? Again, scientific societies are great resources for this. They offer training about both the issues and the how-tos. A couple of examples: the American Geophysical Union has a program called Voices for Science that trains scientists to communicate their science and engage in policy. The Consortium of Social Science Associations has an annual Congressional Visit Day, takes place in April. The American Association for Cancer Research has a DC event every September called the Rally for Medical Research. There are a lot of options out there. And then social media, we have data showing how this has taken on increasing importance over the past decade. It's another way to get your message in front of policymakers. This is in addition to more conventional ways like calling the office or filling out a web form. And then courtesy. Remember, policymakers are people too. And they're going through some of the same things that you are. They have the same concerns about their health, their jobs, their families. They also worry about the future. And many of them will tell you they got into this business because they care. They care about making a positive difference in the world. Also, remember that science is not entitled to funding. We have to make the case about why it's important. And finally, all of the usual rules of advocacy apply, right? Be polite, be on time, listen to other points of view. Now, I'll talk about a few ways to engage in policy, and many of these you can do from where you are. The first is to sign up for newsletters. If you want to learn about science policy, the issues that are going on, the issues of the day, you can sign up for, I'll tell you about a couple. My organization, AAAS, has one called the Policy Alert. It's a weekly newsletter. It goes out to AAAS members. It's usually the first thing that the staff does every week is we get together on Monday morning and we talk about the news of the previous week. We put it into a newsletter. Our journal Science also has a policy blog called Science Insider, which I love. It's fantastic. And then again, check out your scientific society. A number of you, I'm sure, are members of scientific societies, and many of them have their own newsletters, and they tend to be really good. You can learn something new with a webinar. This was a whole lot more novel a few years ago. Now I feel like I see webinar advertisements every day, but you can still learn a lot from watching a webinar on a lunch break. Engage on social media. A lot of ways to do that. One really easy thing I'll recommend, we have an amazing panel coming up right now in a few minutes. I recommend checking them out on social media, following them wherever they are, seeing what they're talking about on social media and seeing who they follow. Attending a meeting of a government agency. A lot of these are virtual now. Government agencies have advisory committees or boards that hold public meetings regularly, and most, if not all, are streamable these days. For example, NIH, the National Institutes of Health, has a videocast website where you can find all sorts of live events. So these are a great way to learn what's going on at the federal agencies. And then joining advocacy days, I mentioned this earlier, these are opportunities to get together with individuals who share your policy interests, to advocate for science or graduate education or whatever inspires you. They involve some element of training, and sometimes organizations will even schedule the meetings for you. I mentioned a couple earlier, and a lot of these have shifted back to in-person, which is often in DC, but some of them are also can be back home in district offices. So one example of that is there's a district visit day that's sponsored by the American Institute of Biological Sciences every summer. Another one is submitting, there we go, public comments. So beyond Capitol Hill, the federal agencies are constantly asking scientists and other stakeholders for input through requests for information or requests for public comment. These are featured on regulations.gov, but I don't actually recommend going there to find these opportunities. A better way to watch for them, I think, is to subscribe to some of the newsletters I mentioned earlier. The Policy Alert, for example, we go through that ourselves. We pull out opportunities that we think our readers might be interested in, and we put them in a little action item blurb at the top. So, let some of these organizations do that work for you. Certainly recommend connecting with other organizations, particularly those that provide networking opportunities with other scientists and engineers and students that are interested in policy. A few of them are on this slide. First, the Engaging Scientists and Engineers in Policy Coalition. Pretty sure that's how Dan and I met. This is a coalition that I helped to start. It's all about connecting organizations that are working to empower scientists and engineers to engage in policy at all levels of government. And we hold networking events. We have a science policy happy hour in DC. We also do events at the AAAS annual meeting every year. Another great one is the National Science Policy Network. I'm sure a number of you are already familiar with NSPN. It's a national network of student science policy and advocacy groups. We're a longtime partner of them. And then there's ESOL, Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally. This is an organization begun and led by a former AAAS policy fellow. This group does amazing work. Their newsletter alone, I just love it. It profiles scientists who are doing work on the local level in all different ways. It's really interesting to see. You're familiar with the other two. the Union of Concerned Scientists and its science network, tens of thousands of scientists and engineers focused on advocacy, and then the Journal for Science Policy and Governance. Full disclosure, I chair the governing board of this journal. I'm so proud to be part of it because it's a really excellent opportunity for grad students, postdocs, and early career researchers to write about policy. Adriana can tell you all about it. And that is an interdisciplinary peer-reviewed journal, and it operates on both the domestic and the international level and covers all sorts of policy issues. And finally, of course, do not forget to register to vote. It's so important. You knew I was going to say that. So as I said at the beginning, the past few years have really opened up some opportunities. Now many science organizations have experienced both with in-person and virtual advocacy. We've found a number of these efforts to be largely successful. So now we as scientists and engineers and students really get to pick and choose the ways in which we want to proceed with advocacy. There are a mix of activities going on. Participation is available to a number of different people. And remember, aside from federal advocacy, there's real potential for change on the state and local level as well. And with the upcoming election, even federal legislators will be spending time back home. And state and local lawmakers are continually looking for advice and scientific expertise. And AAAS has a number of programs that operate on that level as well. So finally, I want to end by drawing your attention to a resource that was developed by a team of scientists led by American University. I was part of that team. It's a booklet. It's a very easy read. It's called Evidence-Based Communication with Policymakers. And it's tips developed from our research on both lawmakers and scientific organizations, just practical tips on communicating your science with policymakers. So I recommend checking that out if this is of interest to you. And then finally, this is me. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any follow-up questions. I'm also happy to take questions right now, as many as we have time for. And I'll go ahead and end there. Here. Am I still sharing? Yeah, I'm still sharing. Okay, here we go.
Does anybody have any questions for Erin? Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much, Erin. Appreciate your insight. I think
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna move on to the panel discussion for everyone. I just want to prompt the audience at the beginning that we're hopefully going to focus on taking questions from you all, trying to turn the typical panel discussion format on its head a little bit. And instead of asking a bunch of questions from the moderator, I'm going to turn it directly over to you all after I ask one introductory question of everyone. Hopefully you had a chance to look at their bios, so that way we don't have to read you all of their amazing accomplishments, and instead can focus on conversation. So I'm going to go through each panel member, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves by telling us what inspired you to work in the career of science, in the field of science policy, and what has been the most exciting moment in your career so far. And so I will open it up with Adriana.
Oh, no pressure there. Okay. Well, thanks for this question. It's I have a lot to say about this, but we'll try to keep it brief. So what inspired me to work in the field, I got involved in advocating for science and research as a trainee, kind of grassroots, bottom up, trying to do things in the institutions where I was without having any power. And but that really did actually inspire to try to do more and figure out where those places would be where I could actually have an impact on research and the future of STEM. So I think it's evolved sort of from being a trainee and realizing what it's like to not be able to do things and looking for places where that impact could happen. And then through a number of opportunities, which I wouldn't go into everything, but I worked with a nonprofit that was doing research on research, and then slowly inched my way into advocating for research. And again, ended up working with Society for Neuroscience, really my first sort of big leap into the field. And really, I've always been motivated to try to impact and improve science from wherever I was, because I grew up in science, and that's something that's been in my family, but also in my professional life for many years. So I think the most exciting moment, I would say, well, there's sort of two things, because I had sort of two phases of my career so far. One is sort of this, what we're able to achieve bottom up when we were trainees early on, starting out and trying to make change, again, with little power, but through what we were able to do to push universities to support students and trainees in STEM. That was working on postdoc salaries. I think it was 2016 or so, and we're able to actually push institutions to increase salaries in a few places. So that is one exciting thing, again, starting out and realizing that we can actually do something. And then later, fast forward about 7 years or so until when I worked with the University of California system, I was able to actually include language on postdocs into the CHIPS Act through some of the work we did there. So that really came full circle of the work that we've been doing on postdocs starting out. And at that point, I was in a space where I could actually impact something in legislation. And that was really exciting to be able to pitch that to legislators and see that happening and become a law. So yeah, can talk more later.
Cool. That's all awesome. I'll just go around my screen. So next up, Max.
Well, first, Dan, thanks for having me. Nice to meet you all. My name is Max. I've been doing health policy, science policy for almost 20 years now. My career started as a scientist. I started doing sort of biomedical research as an undergrad, and I was working at NIH one summer, and it was really a phenomenal experience. But I think there was a point in time where I was dissecting a rat and probably not doing it very successfully, when I realized, like, this is important for the world, but this is not what I as Max should be doing with my time. So it was a great experience in the sense that, I learned a lot, but I learned something very important, which was like, this is not how I should be spending my career and my time going forward. So I knew I wanted to continue to support science and work on behalf of science, but I also knew that I was not going to be the guy at a lab bench for 12 hours a day dissecting rats or running experiments. So that's what sort of got my brain thinking about how can I engage in this world of science without being a card-carrying sort of bench scientist. And that's when my eyes were open to this world of science policy, which something that most undergraduates do not get any exposure to, but by virtue of being from DC, I was able to have some awareness of that. And when I finished college, I managed to land a job at the National Science Foundation, which is where I sort of started my science policy career. And I bounced through another, God knows how many jobs between then and now. It's been quite a few. And when I look back and think through, what were some of the things that I was most excited and proud of, I think there were two that really stand out in my mind. One of them was when I was the chief policy officer at a rare disease foundation. I spent a lot of time doing state advocacy and was trying to convince more states to screen for more rare diseases in newborn babies. And this is so important because most of these diseases are so rare that they are extremely difficult to diagnose. So if you miss them in a newborn, that baby literally might not survive or will have damage for the rest of their life. So you can diagnose them shortly after birth, get them on treatment, you can literally save that baby's life. So I successfully worked in California and in other states to get more diseases screened for in newborns. And when someone did a retrospective study of the law that we passed in California, we found that it saved 20 babies in the first year that it was implemented. So like that was a moment for me, because policy can be very abstract. And then when someone publishes a paper and says these 20 babies might not be around, but for this law, it's like, okay, this is extremely important work. And it was a sort of big realization for me. The other one was at the federal level, and Dominique and I worked at the White House together, and what a wild ride that was, Dom. But one of the things that I had the opportunity to work on was helping to lead the creation of a new federal agency called the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health. For those not familiar with ARPA, it stems from DARPA, and there's a whole constellation of these sort of high risk, high reward agencies that are intended to fund really sort of off the wall science and create innovations that are potentially transformative and game changing. So in less than 2 years, we created an agency from scratch and convinced Congress to fund it with over $2 billion. So that's not something that happens every day, and that is another thing that I was very proud to have worked on, and very different from working at the state level, working on newborn screening. It's a totally different scale of policy, but both of those certainly stand out in my mind as things that I was excited about and continue to feel proud to have played some part in making happen.
That's awesome. Those are certainly some big policy wins and exciting moments. Keep going around. I'll hand it over to Dominique.
Hi, can you all hear me? Okay, fantastic. Hi, everybody. My name is Dominique Carter. I'm an interdisciplinary scientist and bioengineer by training. I'm trained in chemistry, mathematics, microbiology, immunology, molecular genetics, and bioengineering and biotechnology. And ultimately, the goal of me going into science was literally to improve the lives of others through science and discovery. I didn't know what that looked like, but I always had an affinity for science. I started doing research in the lab when I was 14, Rush University Medical Center in Chicago. I'm from Chicago. But that was my first time doing research where I actually had to extract tissue from a cadaver and then isolate cells and like do a whole thing. And so when I came home and tried to explain to my parents like what I was doing exactly, they were just kind of like, what do you mean? Like, we didn't know you were going to be in a morgue. But it really kind of solidified because I was really good. And I worked for this. My PI during that summer experience was this Hungarian woman who was just like very like strict and hardcore. She was the type not to give compliments, but if you did something wrong, she would just rail you. And so I never got railed, so I knew my data was good. And then I found out that my data, she was using my data to apply for a R01 that later got funded. I was like, oh yeah, I think I'm supposed to be doing this. So I loved research, which led me to go on and complete a PhD. But I would say like in the last year or so of my PhD, like my PI, who was funded at the time, had a R21 and a R01 and was a collaborator on another grant, was frantically worried all the time, like if he was going to get another grant after his funding ran out. And mind you, he was NIH funded. My pre-doctoral work was funded by NIAID, the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease. And I was just like, this can't be a way of life. Like, I don't want to stress my uterus. I honestly don't want to stress myself. Like, I want to do science, but I if this is what it looks like, I don't want it. So then I started asking questions. Who are the people that are making these decisions about who and how much scientists can get funded, who's determining what research is worthy of funding, and like really kind of delving into the policy behind that. And then it was alarming to me that a lot of the folks that were making these decisions around fundings to the agencies were not trained in science. And I was like, oh, this doesn't make sense to me. So in my naivete at the time, I was like, no problem. I'll go advocate for funding, fix the problem, go back to the lab. I mean, like it was so simple, like other scientists hadn't tried to do that. And so that was my introductory. I applied and was accepted into the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship that Aaron talked about. I think we have another alum on the call, Libby, right? And that really kind of just changed the trajectory of my career and just my understanding of like how broad science policy is. And so I started out at the National Science Foundation. I supported the Office of the Director, specifically on international science and engineering, trying to identify scientific synergies between low and middle income countries and Africa and Eastern Europe to be able to identify what would be an appropriate delegation to host at NSF to talk about possible collaboration. And from there, I was recruited to the USDA Office of the Chief Scientist, where I served as an agricultural science advisor and worked on agricultural research and education and extension activities. And that really kind of opened the door because from there, I got asked to join the inaugural Health and Life Sciences team with Max at the White House. And that was really, so all those experiences, yes, I worked on policy. At NSF, what does policy look like? Solicitations. At USDA, what does that look like? Departmental directives, also strategic planning, establishing a new science brand for USDA. Their USDA is known for federal nutrition assistance programs, not science. I know I'm probably running over, but one last point, Dan. And one of the most exciting policy pieces that came out of my time in OSTP with Max is being able to be the lead author on the first ever national strategy on hunger, nutrition, and health. So the COVID-19 pandemic revealed that we have an issue with non-communicable diseases in this country, particularly diet-related illness, and how variable it is across the population, and just coming to the terms that a lot of that, all of that is due to faulty policy. So how can we remedy that and fix that so that we have less people dying from food? The food that we consume, the food that's available to certain groups, like how do we rectify that? So the chapter that I was lead author of was for Pillar 5, which focused on how can we enhance or advance food and nutrition security research across the federal government, particularly because that serves as the basis as the policy that determines what kind of food we eat, or the policy suggestions for what type of food we should eat. And so I'll stop there because I feel like I've been talking a long time. But I'm gonna post my bio because I have a new job in the chat so you all can see. Okay.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you. And last but not least, Libby.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Oh, did I just freeze? Sorry about that. But am I coming through okay now for others? Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Libby O'Hare. I am the Director of Government Relations at the Radiological Society of North America, a position that I started just about 7 months ago. So happy to be here with you all tonight. Looking forward to the discussion. So, I think for me, similar themes to what others have said. I sort of have been interested in and passionate about science as long as I can remember. My mom tells me stories about how I was 5, 6 years old playing scientist, where I would set up a lab and I was just really obsessed with science. I also have always been really fascinated by humans and trying to understand them, trying to understand kind of what makes us tick. And I think so that's partially what led me to get my PhD in cognitive neuroscience, was that drive to sort of really understand humans and human behavior. And so I think for me, what inspired me to go into science policy was I love science, as I said. I actually enjoyed doing brain surgery on rats. Loved Max's little anecdote earlier. But when I was in grad school, I was confronted, I really just sort of went through this period of reflection, and a little bit of what Dominique was talking about in terms of not wanting to have to constantly be worried about funding and that kind of thing. So that's what I mean, threads I heard from other panelists. But I went through this period of self-reflection, and I realized that a lot of the things that I really enjoyed doing in my day-to-day life, public speaking, thinking big picture, communicating science to kindergartners and my next door neighbor, were things that I felt that I couldn't really do in the lab or as an academic-based researcher. And that really led me down this path of discovery to realize that I was really passionate about this broader role that science plays in society. And then that led me to find the AAAS fellowship. And I, like Dominique, I intended to use it as a stepping stone, which I did. So let's see. I was thinking today, when I was eating my lunch, what was going to be my answer to Dan's question about the most exciting moment in my career. And one of the things that I realized, and this is true 14 years in, the vast majority, and I'm talking probably 95% of the things that I have accomplished that I'm the most proud about, are from stopping bad things from happening. And so that's a really important part of policy, and a science policy, and we can talk more about that. I think when people, and I say this with all great respect to my fellow panelists, when you work at the White House, you get to actually do things, right? Because you're in the office building that's in charge of the whole apparatus, right? But so I think that stopping bad things from happening is important. But I would say that probably one thing that I was able to do, which was more on the other side of actually trying to do some good. So when I worked at the National Academy of Sciences, I was fortunate enough to work on a high profile consensus study that was looking at the regulatory environment that governs research at universities. And I became really passionate about it because the sort of idea of the partnership between the federal government and universities coming out of World War II, I think has really animated so much of the success of science in the 20th and 21st century, both in the United States, but worldwide. And so this report was really aimed to sort of look at finding the right balance between being appropriate stewards of the taxpayer dollar in the university research setting, but making sure that we were still able to sort of drive that innovation and that creativity that has really made the US the world leader in science. And so we worked really hard on that report, and it got the attention of Senator Lamar Alexander, and in something that I think is mostly unheard of in the science policy space, in the span of about 16 months, our report went from being completely fully written, which was a lot of work, to actually fully implemented in statute in the 21st Century Cures Bill, which was signed into law at the end of 2016. And so it was really quite remarkable to be able to see that happen, like, as I said, like in less than a year and a half. Normally, as we all know, and we can talk more about this, these types of things can take, and they should take, many, months, years, et cetera, to get implemented. And so these were issues really around, the use of animals and humans in research, balancing the administrative burden to researchers and to research institutions, all of those kinds of things. So pretty wonky stuff, but I would say that was a pretty inspiring moment to be able to see that happen in such a short period of time. And to see I see these, the downstream, here we are 8 years later, and I see rulemakings that stem from that bill that stems from our report, right? So that's really fun to see over the course of a long period of time. And just to be entirely clear, I would love to work in the White House. So that was not at all a dig to my colleagues who have had the great joy of working at OSTP, but it's a different world over there, as I'm sure they'll tell you.
Awesome. Well, thank everyone so much. I hope that all gave people some idea of some common themes about what inspires people to work in science policy. Hopefully, you all share some of those motivations and some, I don't know, I think great stories about what you can accomplish if you go into the field. I am now going to open it up to questions from the audience. I hope you all are a chatty bunch, so I don't have to call on people at random. But who is going to ask the first question? Oh, sorry. Emma, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for your introductions. I was curious along your illustrious careers, what have been like some of the biggest challenges that you've encountered? You've talked a lot about like the positives of your work, and I'm just curious, what are some obstacles that some of us might need to prepare for as we embark on this journey?
I'll do a go around. Oh, does Libby want to go? I'll let Libby go first, do a quick go around.
No, Dan, if you want to, however, I didn't realize how we were going to go, but if you want to pick it, that's fine. I don't have to.
I'll just have everybody answer the question quickly. I'll encourage everybody to keep it to like a few sentences. We have, I think, about 18 minutes left to this part of the program. So Libby, you go first.
Yeah, so my quick answer to that is there was a pretty big cultural shift, at least initially for me. I think when you've kind of been trained as a scientist, you're sort of accustomed to this idea that over time, the science will kind of carry the day. And policymaking is not science. And so there are many more sort of variables, factors, and things like that that go into policymaking. And especially this for me was really reflected because I was a congressional fellow on the Hill. And so, this idea that even if the science is crystal clear to the extent that it can be, that doesn't automatically mean that the science has to carry the day. You still have to figure out how to negotiate and broker and compromise on the whole host of issues that relate to any sort of single public policy.
Okay, we'll just go in reverse order. Dominique.
Sure. I would say something you need to prepare yourself for is strategy. So while your policy or something you may want to move forward may be congruent with the administration or your organization's policy agenda, the path to doing that may not be clear. And you may have to find allies that you don't commonly work with in other offices to put your policy on that train so it can continue to move. And that's something that nobody really prepares you for. And that requires really a specific and kind of unique level of social skills, communication skills, persuasiveness, and influence, which are things that scientists don't often talk about. But when we talk about policy, those things are required.
Awesome. Max?
I want to talk about two buckets of issues very quickly. The first is the political environment of policymaking, which can either be your biggest ally or your worst enemy in trying to get something done. The way, if you're working on an issue that is heavily politicized, let's say reproductive rights, for example, you need to think about a way to make your policy idea fit the politics of the decision makers. And that's like some of the most important advice I think I could leave this group with, is thinking about how to frame your policy idea in a way that's going to resonate in a political way with your audience. The other piece is like, anytime you have any policy idea, most ideas require money. And convincing Congress, the state legislature, local folks to break off what is often an extremely constricted chunk of a state federal budget to do something new is a major challenge. And you need to be prepared to think through how you're going to convince them to provide funding and do it in a way that doesn't disenfranchise a legacy interest.
And Adriana.
Yeah, I guess something I'd say is priorities. So if you're, representing an organization and they're always trying to get a number of different things done from that standpoint of what are the things we're going to advocate for this year. To Max's point, what does this look like in the political environment? What can we actually achieve? And how is that going to be impacted by what's going on in the federal government? The other thing is, I think we all have opinions and reasons why we got into this field. And so I think being able to either fold that into the group that you're working with or kind of set that aside and say, okay, I'm here to represent this organization. This is what I'm doing today. I may not agree, or I have other thoughts about what I want to see. But that's a good point, I think, for everyone here to think about where you are and who you work for. And that becomes sort of your driving force. And hopefully you agree with those things, but set your own views aside sometimes.
Awesome. Hey, Magdalena.
Hi, can you all hear me? Great. I just had one question. Considering that a lot of the panel come from almost like a bench work science background, I was just curious to find out what are some of the soft skills that you developed from the bench that you feel like were very helpful for you in this career, and what you can advise, especially some of us on the panel who are still currently on the bench work and trying to make that transition, and trying to find like how best can we be preparing ourselves for hopefully transitioning into those careers that you'd be like, for now, you have great opportunity to focus on this. That's really helpful in this field. Thank you.
Great. Do you want to go around again? Dominic, I see your hand up. Did you want to add?
And the reason why I put my hand up is because I had the same question coming out when I was like, okay, I think I want to go into science policy. I didn't have any resources at my institution at the time. So this is something that I love this question and I really wanted to answer. So forgive me, Dan, if I take a minute.
No,
but
go ahead.
I think it's important, one, if your institution or organization has any kind of science policy, science communication groups, I think it would be great for you to join. When I was in graduate school, we didn't have any such group. I mean, it started like I was in the process of starting it and then I left. So you can take advantage of opportunities through scientific organizations. So for example, my first policy experience while I was in graduate school was with ASBMB, the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology. They host a Hill Day, and you apply to that. And for that day, it's really, they match you with a mentor, and then you go and meet with congressional or Senate representatives from your state, like where you live, who serve at the federal level. And then you go and talk to them. They help you prepare points. Oh, I'm a graduate student. Scientific funding is important, and this is why, la, la, la. Sometimes some of the members or senators, they host like a welcome to Washington Day or like a little party. So you don't have to meet with their staffers. You can actually meet them in person. And so if you can take a science communication class or a science policy class, if that's available at your institution, please take advantage of it. But there are a lot of opportunities now because people see the value in having scientists do policy. So there are an abundance of opportunities like the one that you all are participating in now, and partner societies. So some of the organizations that Erin mentioned in her presentation, or organizations like that. There's another organization that hosted, it's AMBI, the American Institute for Medical and Biological Engineering. Not sure of like the plethora of scientific backgrounds we have on the call, but they have this Public Policy Institute for Rising Leaders where they host you in DC, they fly you out, put you up in a hotel, and you get 2 full days of like both legislative and executive policy experience. You hear from experts that are current political appointees, folks who work on the Hill, have transitioned, were scientists, maybe working in policy and industry or a non-government organization. Really kind of your introduction to how varied the career options can be if you choose to go into that. So those are some things that I would recommend. Thank you, Dan, for calling me first.
Yeah, no problem. That was a great list of resources. I also wish that there were more resources when I was in grad school, and a certificate program like this, I definitely would have signed up for. Do other people in the panel want to add to that?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. So Dom gave a very like practical, real world solution set to the question. I would say, you know, in the world of scientists, there's like often this dichotomy between people who are introverted versus extroverted. And I think it's a little bit of a false dichotomy, but I've certainly felt that way when I put myself into situations where I'm like, how the hell did I end up in this room? And you feel imposter syndrome. And I think part of being successful in science policy world means you have to be comfortable interacting with people, and God forbid being likable in a situation where you show up into a room full of strangers, and by the time that meeting is over, they think that they want to work with you, A, and B, you know what you're talking about. So, you know, the way you get there is like you really have to be comfortable sort of being uncomfortable sometimes. And one thing I would actually challenge you all to do is go to like a networking event or reception where you don't know anybody, walk into that event, try to get, you know, contact information from people, like make friends, and really test yourself in that way, because that's going to be a skill set, a really essential skill set that is going to help you be successful in a policy world where a lot of your success actually relies upon your ability to build relationships and get to know people and understand what their needs are, and help them sort of achieve what they're looking for. So hopefully that was helpful, but I know a lot of folks struggle with that, myself among them. So hopefully that was some helpful advice.
I'll add a quick comment on that. Scientists who are afraid they don't have the social skills for public policy, they're called skills because you can learn them. And so have no fear, you can do it too. Anyone on the panel want to add to that before we go to the next one? All right, next up, Alexa.
Can everyone hear me? Perfect. Yeah, so kind of in the same vein as the last question, I feel like as early career scientists, so much of our training is like becoming experts in a very specific topic, and like we're often discouraged from stepping outside of like our specific training area. So I was just curious, like as you all have navigated, you know, different policy careers or like advocacy topics of interest, how do you approach entering a policy or a topic that you don't have expertise in, like you're brought into a team or something like that? And yeah, just kind of like any tips you have for getting over that, like, oh, I'm not an expert in this, I shouldn't speak on this issue.
Cool. Looks like Libby and Dominique have something. I'll add to the question. Maybe give an example of a time you had to learn something really quickly and what that was like.
Yeah, so I actually think I was kind of not going to say this because I thought others had gotten to it, but I actually think that this is kind of an example of a transferable skill. So I think that scientific training, obviously I'll speak in generalizations, scientific training equips you with the ability to sort of understand and define a problem space. And so you'll be able to quickly know, hey, this isn't my area of expertise. How do I actually learn more about it? And you can work backwards. I talk to people who know more about it than I do. I talk to people who know, who know a lot more about it. I talk to, people who know a little bit more about it. I know what types of, readings that I should be doing, whether they be sort of online, like Google-based type of research, or actually going into the literature, the primary literature, the scientific literature, whatever it happens to be. I know I should read these reports from this think tank, right? So that is a transferable skill, that ability to sort of define a problem and then understand how you're going to go about kind of building the background and knowledge that you need. I guess I would say, one of the things that one of the examples, Dan, that you had like added into the end there, when I first was a fellow, I was working on Capitol Hill. Went from being a postdoc in a neuroscience lab to working on Capitol Hill. So it was quite the change. And what I learned was that the fastest way for me to understand something new was to find someone who was who knew more, who was the subject matter expert, and get them to essentially give me a briefing. And so often that was this organization called the Congressional Research Service, who's the amazing people that work there. That's literally their job, is to be that resource for congressional staff and members. And so I really have become someone who, this is not necessarily the case when I was a grad student, but if I can find someone who can kind of give me the briefing, then it kind of gets stuck in my brain and I get the information that I need. So I think that's a great question and a good example of a transferable skill that you have as a scientist.
Awesome. Dominique.
I would like to second everything Libby said and also add to the fact that, you know, that's something that you actually should become accustomed to and becoming comfortable with the uncomfortable. Just because that is not your specific area of expertise does not mean that you can't contribute meaningfully to whatever policies, issues may arise or be current and relevant in that area. So example for me is the nutrition strategy. I'm not trained in nutrition. My combination of technical expertise makes sense as to why though that expertise and skill set would be applicable to agricultural innovation overall, specifically through biotech. But nutrition is an entirely different game area. And so coming up to speed, how did I come up to speed on that? I definitely reached out to experts, took advantage of my network at USDA, had them point me to experts, had the experts give me papers to read, like just took it all the way back. Like when you first started at the lab, oh, they give you review articles. I needed to immerse myself in the science to actually make sure that whatever suggestions that I was putting forward based on like the skills that I hadn't gotten, you know, from my training as a scientist, but also my science policy fellowship. What is the problem? What are potential solutions? What is the pathway to those solutions? Then I drafted them and put them in front of a variety of experts, people who have way more knowledge in some of these areas than me, and to have them like double down and say, oh yeah, these are great suggestions, or oh, maybe we can add this here. Like it's a collaborative experience. And I know starting out, sometimes that can be intimidating, but I just want to encourage you all not to let, you know, what you may or may not be trained in technically preclude you from pursuing an opportunity to be able to impact and advance policy in any kind of science space. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah. Adriana or Max, do you want to add to that?
Go ahead, Adriana, and I'll jump in.
Yeah,
after.
I think it's a good follow-up from Dominique's point because so I can give you two examples of when the things I worked on were not what I was trained in and it went well. One is, so obviously I have a PhD in biochemistry, but I did a fellowship at Society for Neuroscience. And so that was one point, well, I had to sell sort of my background and that, you know, I had advocated for science, that I had those skills and that I was passionate about advocacy and sort of bypass that idea of, I don't have a PhD in neuroscience. A lot of these societies take people with those disciplinary backgrounds, and rightly so, and it makes sense. They want to train that workforce. And so I was an exception to saying, you know, sort of selling my case of why I want to be here, why I'm interested in this field. And the topic was less important, and I still got the fellowship. And I think still to this day, they mostly take people who are neuroscientists. So don't be discouraged if you don't have the background, if you have the passion for the area, and sort of you can sell that. The second one is, and this is sort of similar to what Livia was saying, my first project when I started the UC system was an AI briefing. And, you know, again, biochemist, I knew zero about AI. Looking at CRS is a good resource, and that's something to get used to, looking at where this information is, because it's not necessarily going to be an academic paper, but think tanks and other organizations produce the background that you can use for this. So we'll talk more about that in the program later. But also, you know, the university itself was a good resource, and who are the experts who are working on AI. At the end of the day, ended up being a relatively general sort of format, right? So once you know how to write these one-pagers, you can translate that to different types of disciplines. And that is another skill set to think about if you're organizing a briefing, and who should be invited. How do we make sure that's diverse in a number of different ways, and who are the experts? And those people really can speak to that, and you're sort of setting the stage for them to have that conversation too. So hope that's helpful.
Awesome. And Max.
I'll be super brief because I want to get to more questions, but I still believe that thinking like a scientist is probably the most important thing I got from all of my education. Not only the ability to think like a scientist, but the ability to communicate with non-scientists. So like, if you think about some of the problems that policy nerds are faced with dealing with, like they are incredibly complex. AI ain't got nothing on most of these problems, honestly, because they're so complex. And like, this is where you can really shine through. When it comes to expertise, the only thing between you and being an expert in something is being willing to do some hard work. Every single one of you, because you're in the sciences, have already done the hard work. So I know everyone is capable of being an expert, even in something that they don't have a degree in. It's just about putting in the time and the effort to learn about it.
Awesome. And I think we need to stop at 7:10. Can we go that late? Okay.
Yeah,
so
that's fine.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to take all three questions. I'll have you all ask them. And then I'm going to go around the panel, and I'm going to ask you to put your science policy skills to the test and answer all three questions in under a minute. I'll time you on my phone, and we'll cut people off, and you can show what it's like to pitch to a policymaker when you have a minute walking down the hall. So Harun, you're up first.
Can you all hear me? Hi, everyone. I heard a lot of success stories. Everyone talked about how their policies worked, their policy change, like how their policy has successfully done. But I want to learn about the other side of the picture as well. What if your policy is not adopted? Then what comes next? How y'all tackle that aspect of the work?
Great. Nina.
Hi, so I noticed that a lot of you, oh, I'm back. Okay, I noticed that a lot of you have had different positions in your careers, and I guess I'm wondering if that's fairly common to have various roles, and kind of what the turnover is, if any, per job that you have within the policy world.
Awesome. And Kiana.
My question was more about, it looks like a lot of you guys have held many different roles throughout your journey, and some of you are more or less further away from your PhD. So how did you feel about transitioning between these different roles in drastically different fields?
Awesome. And we have 6 minutes, so a minute and a half each. I'll give you an extra 30 seconds. And we will start, we'll go in, we'll start with Adriana.
Okay. So a question on when the policies were not adopted. I would say that's part of the process. And the longer you've been in the field, you kind of understand what's possible and what's not. I definitely started out thinking, okay, I'm gonna, change the world and hear all the things I want to see, right? And then maybe a third of those happened. And then, I had one thing that I can point to from those 4 years I was with the UC that is really exciting, right? So I think you have to know where the limitations are and also what counts as success, because small things do count along the way that you think, even if the final thing you want to see doesn't happen, small things along the way do count as well. So that's an attitude. Turnover, I think I would say probably around 5 years is on average. People move around in these positions. Definitely some folks have stayed in some of these roles for 10, 20 years. And personally, I think you're more marketable if you move around and learn different skills once you've been in one space and learn different things. And then you can sort of be in different settings. And as we have on this panel, right, we have people who work with Congress, worked at the White House. I think it's a good thing to be able to experience different types of settings, and you learn more about how policy works depending on where you are and seeing different things.
Elevator door has opened. A minute and a half.
Transition between the fields. I think, well, for me, it's been really a common thread throughout all the different things I've worked on, and I've been able to take that into different roles I've had. I think we can talk more about that, but that's really, I think, if you have a area of passion that you can sort of take around to all these different roles, that'll carry you through different opportunities.
Awesome. That was our quick elevator ride. Libby, I'm going to hand it over to you for a minute and a half where you're taking a photo with a member of Congress, and that's all you have.
100%. Actually, because I've worked in Congress, I'm going to tell you, Dan, that really I think questions 2 and 3 can be answered as one question. So I'm going to compress the decision-making space. So what do you do if your policy isn't adopted? Great question. Means there's a part of that sort of varies depending on sort of what your role is in the whole kind of process. I will say that, I feel like I can say that I've been in DC long enough to know that sort of ideas never really go away. And so there's so many aspects of what we do that are policy proposals that have been modernized, but were actually sort of generated 10, 15, 20 years ago. So it's important to kind of make sure we're always staying on top of what's come before us, because those ideas always have an opportunity to come back. Yeah, various roles and transitions. So I think that's a really astute observation, and that is a real difference from academia, right? So in academia, the pathway is very, very clear. Adriana is nodding because she's heard me say this exact same thing to her. The pathway is very clear. The steps are obvious, but guess what? It's actually not super obvious that everyone that wants to become a tenure track investigator can get that job, right? And so when you leave that academic lifestyle, you go into a world where it's much more common, where you're moving around, having to figure out what you want to do next, et cetera. So as you get into science policy, you'll understand the ecosystem and the taxonomy of sort of what you can and cannot do and the different kinds of roles. And slowly that ecosystem will begin to open up more and more, and you'll use your network to figure out what you want to do next and how you're going to go after it. It is not as hard as it seems.
Awesome. I'll hand it over to Max.
So when it comes to public policy making, I would say that it's a marathon and not a sprint. And what I mean by that is, just because you strike out one year doesn't mean you're not gonna get another shot at it the next budget cycle or fiscal year, whatever. So there's always another opportunity to go after something. And the reality is, if you're working on something at the federal level, in year one, you're probably not going to get that thing done. It usually takes many, many shots on goal to actually get one through. And then in terms of career transitions, I think, for me personally, it's been like every 3 years. You could almost set your watch to it. It's kind of weird in that way, but with each job change, you're totally immersing yourself in a new role, new environment, and you learn an insane amount in that amount of time. But that's how you build your bona fides, your expertise, and it makes you more marketable, more valuable in the long run. I mean, the other thing I would mention very briefly is one thing that makes me different from the other 3 panelists is I actually don't have a PhD, and I've managed to talk myself into rooms where I'm routinely the only person without an MD or a PhD. So I know, some of the folks on the call probably have one, others are probably debating that, but the only reason I raise that is because you can still, have a very fulfilling career in public policy. You don't necessarily need to have an advanced degree to do that, the highest degree that is.
Awesome. And last but not least, Dominique.
Thank you. My laptop just shut down. So I'm on my phone now and trying to restart it. But with regards to the first question, I would say that you all should prepare yourself and just know that it's a journey, and you have to kind of think of this as like the long goal, not something with immediate gratification, and not that you shouldn't work hard and diligent as it relates to trying to make as much impact as you can, but to know that it's a process. For example, Max and I both worked on what the National Biotechnology and Biomanufacturing Initiative, also known as the American Bioeconomy Executive Order. That was something that was sitting across 3 administrations. right? And so 3 sets of different experts from different administrations worked on this policy piece. We had the opportunity to be a part of the group to get it to the finish line, but that's just an example. So that's like 10 years, you know? Nevertheless, we got it there, right? So it's really like just looking at that as a long-term goal. In terms of career transitions, particularly as it relates to science, because we're in school so long, when we come out, we're already at an economic loss, right? Some of our friends from undergrad who maybe didn't decide to do that, they were already vesting in their 401ks. This is not necessarily policy. This is like life lessons. So just take this for what it is. But you, I think, should also have in mind, like Max said, he's on the mark for every 3 years. I'm on the mark for every 2 years. And I plan to do that until I'm in business for myself. Because otherwise, research, we now have empirical data to demonstrate that if you don't change that often or in that frequency between 2 to 4 years, you will experience economic loss in terms of a loss of a potential promotion, salary raise, and also in addition to the skills and everything that Max stated that's required, also thinking about your pockets and future life planning, okay? Because they don't talk about that during your graduate school, and it's very relevant.
That's
Thanks,
awesome.
Dan.
That's a great way to end it, and very practical advice for everyone. Okay, I think that's the end of the panel. I'm going to hand it over to Adriana for the next breakout session. Is that correct?
Yes, I think Lauren has the breakout rooms. And so we'll spend, I guess, about 10 minutes, come back at 7:25 or so, just for the last little bit. But you'll have more opportunities to ask each of us questions in breakouts.
I'll go ahead and open the rooms. I might move folks around if need be, but your panelist will join you in just a moment once you're in there. So I hope you all capitalize on this time and ask some rich questions during our next 10 minutes. I'll open them up. Enjoy. Welcome back, everyone. I usually hate to stop the good conversation. So thanks for rejoining. I will pass it back to Dan if you have anything else to wrap up the session, if any words of wisdom or anything you'd like to share before we close for the night.
I did not prepare anything.
Right.
I don't know. I would just say, to all of you, take full advantage of this program. Never be afraid to reach out to people on this panel or anybody who you think has an interesting career and ask them for a few minutes of their time to learn more about it. I think the most important sort of thing I learned early on in my science policy career was the importance of networking and asking for an informational interview, which is a phrase I had never heard of before I went to DC. So yeah, just enjoy the journey, reach out to people if you think you want to learn about them.
Wonderful. Thank you. You went on the spot. It was great. You're putting your skills to use, so it was great.
Yeah, great.
All right. Well, we went through some announcements earlier in the session, so I won't go through those again, but I'll be sending out that email with more information for you with examples and links for those assignments coming up. So please take advantage of that as well, so we'll be able to provide you feedback as we're going into some of these bigger assignments where we're going to have external people reviewing and your chance to get in front of them. So without that, go ahead and enjoy the rest of your days, whether it's evenings or mornings, depending on where you are. But let's give another round of applause to our panelists and to Dan, our moderator, for their time and expertise. And we will be in touch with you all soon. All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye.